Chapter 1. The Exile Lunch. Just moments before my family tried to erase me with a one-way ticket and a $5,000 apology disguised as generosity, I walked into the New Haven Country Club and felt the kind of silence that only exists in rooms where decisions have already been made about you. The chandelier glittered like a spotlight on a stage I never auditioned for, casting perfect light on people who had rehearsed every smile long before I arrived. And in that frozen, polished air, I realized something I had spent years trying not to see. I was not walking into a conversation with my family. I was walking into my own removal, signed and sealed behind their eyes. A quiet execution delivered with linen napkins and polished silver. My heartbeat rose into my throat, steady but distant, as if my body wanted to warn me before my mind could catch up. My name is Alina Ward, and before I ever built a multi-million-dollar future, I stood in that room as the daughter they had already decided to let go, wrapped in love that was nothing more than a beautifully worded verdict. The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the dining room was how still everything felt, as if the air itself had been pressed and polished along with the mahogany paneling. The place was too quiet for noon on a weekend. No chatter from the bar, no movement on the terrace. Only the distant shuffle of staff who pretended not to look in my direction. I had been here 100 times in my childhood, but that afternoon the room felt staged, theatrical, as if someone had ironed the world flat and told it to behave. My father sat at the far side of the round table, back perfectly straight, the sunlight outlining the silver and his hair. Richard lifted his wrist and checked his watch the moment he saw me enter, even though I knew I was on time. My mother, Marilyn, was smoothing the tablecloth with a fingertip, the pearls at her neck glowing like tiny cold moons. Vivian, my sister, had her phone placed screen down in front of her, angled too precisely to be casual. I recognized the setup. They looked like a committee waiting to deliver a verdict. I walked toward them and felt the old pressure settle on my shoulders, the one that always came back whenever I stepped into their world. I said hello, but the greeting sounded thin even to me. No one rose. No softening. My mother finally gestured to the empty chair across from her as if I were a client at a consultation. I sat, the leather cool under my hands, and waited for someone to speak. My father cleared his throat and said we had things to address, matters that could not be ignored anymore. His tone was deliberate, measured, the way he sounded in board meetings when he announced cuts or closures. My mother added that they had watched me make choices that worried them deeply. She used the gentle tone she often performed at charity events, the one layered with performative concern. Vivian chimed in, recounting opinions from unnamed colleagues who supposedly worried about my stability. She used that polished legal vocabulary that turned vague insinuations into weapons. I looked at them one by one and felt a strange detachment slide over me. My father spoke about how I had embarrassed the family for years. My mother talked about tough love and responsibility. Vivian said that I had been making erratic decisions, that people in their circle were beginning to ask questions. She did not say which people, because it never mattered. Their concerns were always shaped by whatever social mirror they feared most at the time. As Vivian shifted in her seat, her phone lit up. The screen flickered for less than a second, but I saw enough. A pre-made social media story template in soft, pastel colors, a message about standing with a family member during a time of crisis. The kind of message crafted not from truth, but for applause. She tapped the screen dark again. She had not expected me to see it. My stomach tightened. not from surprise, but from the confirmation of something I already sensed. They had written the story before they decided to speak to me. My father reached under the table and pulled out a white envelope. He placed it in front of me with a steady hand. He explained that they had discussed my situation and had come to a decision they believed would help me reset my life. Inside the envelope, he said, there was a flight to Austin for the day after tomorrow. Along with it, a check for $5,000 marked as a Fresh Start fund. My mother nodded, her eyes shining with carefully arranged sympathy. I rested my palm on the envelope without opening it. The room had grown too quiet again, the kind of quiet where you can hear your own pulse. I asked them why Austin. My father answered that a more modest city might help me find clarity. My mother said Boston had been too demanding and that the constant pressure of my work had obviously overwhelmed me. Vivian added that my career choices had become unpredictable and that I should take time away before making more mistakes. All of them spoke as if they were discussing a business asset that had depreciated. Memories surfaced quickly, uninvited but sharp. Being 13 and winning a regional science award that my father barely acknowledged because he needed me to help set up at a fundraiser. Vivian getting praised for her law school acceptance, while my acceptance into a top engineering program was met with polite silence. My mother telling guests that I had always been the creative one, in a way that meant inconsistent. Every flash of memory carried the same message. My value had always depended on whether I supported their image. Marilyn reached forward and placed her hand on my wrist. She told me she was terrified of losing me, that if I refused their support, I might fall apart. Her voice trembled at the exact moment it needed to. She was a master at emotional choreography. She knew how to cry in a way that made her seem delicate and virtuous. For a moment, her eyes glistened in the soft light, perfect and practiced. Richard pushed the envelope closer. He said this was what they could offer, a chance for me to start over somewhere quieter, somewhere that reflected the version of me they wanted to believe in. Vivian lifted her phone slightly, angling it to capture all of us, then lowered it again. She said that one day I would understand they were saving me from myself. I finally opened the envelope. The boarding pass was stiff and glossy, Hartford to Austin, my name printed neatly. Behind it sat the check, heavy and crisp, Fresh Start Fund written in my father's exact handwriting. I felt something go still inside me. Not resignation, not hurt. Something cleaner. A clarity I had not felt in years. I slipped both items back into the envelope and placed it in my bag. I thanked them for meeting me. I told them I heard what they were saying. My mother asked if I was upset. I told her I was tired. My father reminded me the flight was in 2 days and that it would be wise to use the time responsibly. Vivian looked satisfied, as if the process had gone exactly the way she expected. I pushed my chair back and stood. For a moment, I let myself look at them, the 3 people who had shaped my childhood and spent years insisting that their version of me was the only one that mattered. They looked small in that moment, though the room was enormous around them. I turned and walked across the silent dining room, my footsteps soft on the carpet, past the staff who avoided eye contact out of habit. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face and cleared the fog in my head. I paused at the top of the stone steps and drew a slow breath. They believed they had pushed me out of their world. They believed they had given me a script to follow. What they did not realize is that silence is not surrender. Sometimes silence is the first step of walking away. I drove back to Boston on autopilot. highway lines sliding under my tires while my mind replayed the country club like a scene from someone else's life. By the time I reached my neighborhood, the sky had shifted to that pale gray that makes everything look a little drained. I parked on the street, climbed the narrow stairs to my third-floor walk-up, and let myself into the apartment that had nothing of my family in it. The place was small and a little cluttered, but every book on the shelves and every mug in the cabinet had gotten there without their money or their approval. My Stanford sweatshirt was folded on the back of the couch, my laptop sat open on the coffee table, a spreadsheet of crop yield data frozen mid-calculation. The air smelled faintly of coffee and solder from a sensor I had been fixing the night before. It felt like stepping back into my real life after walking through a very expensive hallucination. I dropped my keys in the bowl by the door and pulled the envelope from my bag. I set it on the kitchen counter and stared at it for a second, then turned away and opened the fridge instead. Leftover takeout, a few eggs, a half-empty jar of salsa. I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, the morning with my family starting to feel unreal, like something that might evaporate if I did not touch it. The envelope stayed where it was, white and neat and out of place. My eyes drifted to the framed print on the wall, a photograph of the Stanford Quad in early fall. I had taken it during my second year when I still believed that excellence could drown out everything else. Those years had been the first time in my life I was surrounded by people who cared more about ideas than family names. Leaving there for Boston had felt like stepping onto a narrow bridge. Founding TerraSense felt like jumping off it without a net. I remember the day in 2018 when the grant committee email landed in my inbox. I had been sitting in the campus cafe, refreshing my inbox so often my fingers cramped. When the subject line finally appeared, my heart had thudded so hard I thought the whole room could hear it. The congratulations were written in polite academic language, but to me they meant one simple thing. I had $90,000 and permission to build something I believed could change how small farmers survived climate volatility. When I called home that night, my father had said it was nice to hear I was keeping busy. He had changed the subject to a golf tournament within 2 minutes. The first TerraSense prototype came together in a shared lab space in an old brick building outside Kendall Square. I hired a tiny team on short contracts, people who believed enough to take a risk. Some of the senior engineers we consulted treated me like a bright intern rather than the person whose name was on the project. They called me kid in meetings and explained basic concepts I had been teaching undergrads for years. A few times I heard them lower their voices in the hallway and say that the system was ambitious for someone with my level of experience. I learned to let their words slide off on the outside while cataloging every bug on the inside. In 2019, I pitched TerraSense to an early-stage investor named Harper Lane. Her office in Back Bay looked like a furniture catalog, all clean lines and tasteful plants. I walked her through our pilot results, our projections, the potential for scaling. She listened, nodded, asked sharp questions. At the end, she smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes and told me the tech was interesting, but she did not see leadership presence in me. She said farmers needed a face they could trust, and investors needed a founder who could dominate a room. On my way down in the elevator, I stared at my reflection in the mirrored walls and wondered what kind of face she thought farmers trusted. By 2021, the system was ready for a large-scale field test. We partnered with the farm in Iowa, a family operation trying to survive unpredictable seasons. I remember standing at the edge of those fields in borrowed rubber boots, watching the sensors blink to life. For a few weeks, everything looked promising. Then a string of anomalies showed up in the data. A miscalibration in one of the modules cascaded into a recommendation error. A section of crops suffered. Caleb Bronson, who managed the farm, yelled at me in front of his crew, furious and afraid. He said people like me played with numbers and went home while his family ate the consequences. I went back to Boston with the taste of that failure like metal in my mouth. Some of the engineers who had doubted me earlier treated it like proof of their instincts. One of them, a senior consultant brought in to advise, told me that maybe the idea was ahead of its time and that I should consider shelving it and moving on. I nodded while he spoke and tried to ignore the way my hands were clenching under the table. That night I sat in the lab until dawn, scrolling through line after line of logs, chasing the exact moment the error had been born. By early 2022, most of the original contracts had ended. People needed steady salaries, not promises. I didn't blame them. For a while, it was just me and Dana. She was younger than me by a few years, sharp and funny, with the way of seeing patterns in messy data that felt like almost a magic trick. She would show up with 2 coffees and sit beside me, eyes on the monitor, and say that the system was not broken, it was just telling us what we had refused to see. When I muttered that maybe everyone had been right to doubt me, she told me to write that down too so we could laugh at it later. Then she made sure every test, every fix, every conversation about parameters was logged and backed up twice. It was Dana who first said that keeping receipts wasn't about paranoia. It was about refusing to let anyone rewrite the narrative later. She meant investors or skeptical consultants, but the words landed somewhere deeper in me that I did not name at the time. We rebuilt the algorithm from the ground up. I slept on the lab couch so often that I started keeping a change of clothes in the cabinet. The vending machine guy learned my name. One Tuesday in late winter, after a stretch of days that blurred together, we pushed a new version live on a closed simulation. The graphs that had been jagged and unstable for months began to smooth out. Input variability went up and output errors stayed low. We watched it for an hour, then another. 98% stability stayed on the screen like a dare. My chest felt heavy and strangely light. Around that time, the email from the Boston Tech Summit arrived. I opened my laptop between tests and saw the subject line inviting TerraSense to present in a session on resilient agriculture. For a moment, I simply stared at it, waiting for the words to rearrange into something ordinary. When I read it out loud, Dana grinned and said that this was what happened when you ignored people who lacked imagination. She said we'd need to polish the slides because this time the room would be full of people who knew what they were talking about. We spent the next weeks balancing live tests and presentation prep. I practiced explaining complex sensor fusion in language a room full of investors and researchers could digest in 10 minutes. Dana would stop me when I drifted into jargon and tell me to start again. Little by little, the story of TerraSense shifted from apology to possibility. I still had nights where I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my apartment, inventorying risks like beads on a string. But there were more mornings when I woke up eager to get back to the lab. On a Tuesday in late winter, after a stretch of days that blurred together, we pushed a new version live on a closed simulation. The graphs that had been jagged and unstable for months began to smooth out. Input variability went up and output errors stayed low. We watched it for an hour, then another. 98% stability stayed on the screen like a dare. My chest felt heavy and strangely light. On the Friday before the summit, I stood alone in the dim glow of the monitors, the hum of servers the only sound. The latest run had just ended. The system had held its performance with noisy input and ugly edge cases, the kind of real farms deal with and polished models hate. 98% stared back at me from the graph, persistent and calm. I exhaled slowly and felt a line inside me untie. I saved the logs, copied the most important visualizations into a separate folder, and opened a blank presentation. The cursor blinked at the top of the first slide as I typed the word TerraSense and my name below it. Outside, the city lights of Boston flickered against the windows. Inside, I started arranging the evidence of everything we had built, preparing to show it to people who did not know me, did not know my family, and didn't care about the ward reputation. All they would care about was whether the numbers held and whether the system worked. That was the kind of judgment I was ready to face. Chapter 3: The 48-Hour Silent Counterstrike. The next morning, I booked a ticket out of Logan and packed a suitcase that looked more like I was going on a long weekend than walking away from an entire life. A couple of suits, jeans, 2 pairs of shoes, my laptop, external drives, a folder of printed reports, and the small black notebook where I kept the things that never belonged in emails. The envelope from my parents lay on the table. I took out the check and slipped it into the notebook, left the Austin boarding pass behind, and closed my apartment door on the rest. At the gate, people lined up in familiar clusters, a small crowd heading to Chicago on a chilly weekday morning. While they called our boarding groups, I texted my mother a simple message. "I got the ticket. I need some time. I will be out of Boston for a while." Her reply came almost immediately. "We are glad you are taking this seriously. Use this time wisely." No questions, no details. They did not ask where I was actually going, and I did not offer it. Let them imagine Austin. It was easier that way. On the plane, I took a window seat and watched the ground drop away. Boston shrank into a map, then into patterns of clouds. My mind moved ahead of the flight, into a glass building in downtown Chicago and the conference room where people would ask questions that finally mattered. Every so often, my hand went to the notebook in my bag, feeling the stiff edge of the check pressed between its pages. O'Hare was its usual chaos: announcements and rolling suitcases and people moving like schools of fish. A driver holding a sign with my name waited near the exit. The ride into the city felt almost unreal, the skyline cutting into the cloudy sky, the river slicing through the buildings like a dark vein. AgriCorp's headquarters rose out of the street as a wall of glass and steel, the kind of place built by people who believed in efficiency more than warmth. At the front desk, they gave me a visitor badge and sent me up to the 20th floor. The conference room had a view that made the city look like a model. Inside, a long table, a screen on the wall, and a carafe of coffee waiting like a peace offering. Ethan Cole came in first, tall, with tired eyes, the air of a man who had seen too many pitches and too few that held up in the real world. He shook my hand firmly. "Alina, thanks for coming out. We're going to run you through some questions. Nothing personal. We just like to see everything up close." "That is exactly what I want," I said. 3 other engineers joined us, all senior, all seasoned, all carrying laptops bristling with stickers from past projects. We did not waste time on small talk. Ethan gestured to the screen. "Walk us through TerraSense from the ground up. Assume we know nothing and that we do not trust your slides." I almost smiled at that. I plugged in my laptop and brought up the first model, the early version that had failed in Iowa, then the iterations that came after. I walked them through sensor placement, data ingestion, how we dealt with noise and outliers. They interrupted often. "What happens if this node loses power? Show me the failure mode here. Where is the log for that anomaly?" Every time I had an answer. Logs, emails, time-stamped notes. I put up graphs from the worst days as well as the best. I did not try to hide the Iowa crash. I showed them exactly where the miscalibration had started and how the correction had changed the pattern. One of the engineers, a woman with gray streaks in her hair and sharp eyes, nodded when I finished that section. She said, "Most people try to bury their worst charts. I'd rather see someone who knows where the bodies are." I answered questions for hours, my voice steady even when my heart hammered. At one point, Ethan leaned back and looked at me for a long moment. "How many people are on your team right now?" I met his gaze. "Right now, it's just me and one data engineer on contract. I lost some people after the Iowa test. They needed more stability than I could promise." He did not look surprised, just thoughtful. "All right," he said. "We're going to take a short break, then we'll have you meet with legal and our risk assessment folks." He stood, and the others followed. As they left, my shoulders sagged for the first time. I poured myself a cup of coffee with hands that finally trembled a little now that no one was watching. A few minutes later, a man in a navy suit walked in carrying a thin folder. He introduced himself as Liam Becker, Counsel for Internal Risk and Compliance. He had the calm, contained energy of someone used to delivering bad news in a neutral tone. "Alina, I've gone through what you submitted. We just need to clarify a few things around funding. We have to understand who might claim a piece of this if we move forward." I nodded. "Ask whatever you need." He flipped open the folder. "You listed grant funding, some small consulting revenue, and a line that says no external equity investment. That is accurate." "Yes. No one has put money into TerraSense in exchange for ownership." "What about family involvement? Any money, gifts, loans that could be interpreted as seed funding?" The question hung there, heavier than it sounded. I reached into my bag and pulled out the notebook. Sliding the check from its pages, I laid it on the table between us. "My parents gave me this yesterday. They called it a fresh start fund and booked a flight for me to go restart my life in another city. I haven't cashed it yet. It's the first and only time they've ever given me money that could be connected to my work." Liam picked up the check, turned it over, studied the memo line, "Fresh Start Fund," in my father's careful script. He looked back at me. "Did they sign any documents with you? Any emails where they refer to this as an investment in TerraSense?" "No, they think my work is a problem, not an asset." He nodded slowly. "All right, from where I sit, this is a personal gift. It's not tied to your company. There's no contract, no equity agreement, no cap table entry. If they ever tried to claim ownership based on this, they wouldn't go far." Something in my chest loosened at his calm tone. "So if I cash it, that doesn't change anything?" "It doesn't change the nature of what it is. They already labeled it as a fresh start fund. That's their wording, not yours. Legally, you're in the clear." He slid the check back toward me. I tucked it into the notebook again, feeling its edges in a new way, not as a leash, but as a record. While I was sitting in that glass room in Chicago, my family was busy writing their version of the story. I didn't know the details until later when I finally let myself look. Vivian's Instagram carried a quiet post, a photo of a shoreline, a caption about standing by family during difficult seasons. Marilyn told her charity circle that I was taking some time away from Boston to work through personal challenges. Richard sent an email to his contact list saying that I had decided to step back from my high-pressured work to get grounded and reflect. They were so eager to narrate my supposed collapse that it never occurred to them to ask what I was actually doing. When the meetings resumed, I found myself back with Ethan and the engineers, this time in a smaller office with a long window. Outside, the sky had gone from gray to a pale, tired blue. Inside, the air felt heavier. Ethan folded his hands on the table. "We've seen the numbers. We've seen the worst days and the best. We've talked with your trial partners. We know about the Iowa hit and the recovery. We've also talked with your references at Stanford." He let that hang for a moment, then continued. "We think TerraSense fits exactly where we need to be in the next decade. We'd like to acquire the technology and bring you on as Director of Sustainable Systems here in Chicago." My breath caught, then steadied. I asked the questions I needed to ask about integration, about autonomy, about what would happen to the farmers already using the system. They had answers, real ones, not just glossy phrases. When Ethan slid the draft agreement across the table, my hands were steady. The number at the bottom looked unreal for a second. 8.5 million. Digits that represent all the nights on the lab couch and all the days walking fields in borrowed boots. I thought about the 2020 grant committee, about the thin rejection letter that once made me cry on my bathroom floor. The memory floated up, but instead of burning, it just settled into place as one step on the way to this room. I signed. The pen moved across the paper in clean strokes. There was no soundtrack, no swelling music, just the scratch of ink and the soft hum of the building. Later, sitting alone in a small lounge with a cup of tea I was too wired to drink, I opened my laptop to find an email from a reporter I vaguely recognized. The subject line mentioned an exclusive feature on TerraSense and AgriCorps, scheduled to go live the next morning if I approved the final quotes. I read through the draft, checking details, correcting a couple of dates. The article was straightforward and unsentimental, focused on yields and resilience and climate adaptation. My family name appeared exactly once, tucked in a line about my upbringing in Connecticut. No one would care about the ward reputation. They would care about whether the system worked. I hit reply and typed my approval, then closed the laptop and leaned back. Outside the windows, the city lights were coming on one by one, turning the glass into a mirror. Somewhere back in New Haven, people who had always believed they controlled my story were settling into their routines. In a few hours, they were going to wake up to a version of me they had never made room for. Chapter 4. When Forbes exploded, the family collapsed. Morning in Chicago came with a pale strip of light sneaking around the edges of the blackout curtains in my hotel room. I woke earlier than I needed to, my body still tuned to East Coast time and my mind already humming. For a few seconds, I lay still, listening to the hum of the air system and the distant traffic, and tried to imagine the ward house back in Connecticut. Coffee brewing, the local paper on the table, my father scrolling through his phone before heading to whatever meeting was first on his calendar. I reached for my own phone on the nightstand and hesitated. The Forbes link would go live any minute. I decided to let it arrive on its own. Instead, I got up, showered, put on a clean shirt, and made hotel coffee that tasted like cardboard but kept my hands busy. When I finally unlocked my phone, the notification banner was already waiting. Breaking story on TerraSense acquisition by AgriCorp. I tapped it open. My name was there in the headline. The article was clean and factual. It mentioned my upbringing in Connecticut, my years at Stanford, the grant that launched the company, the rough patch in Iowa, the new role in Chicago. The photo they had used was one AgriCorp had taken the day before. Me standing in front of a wall of monitors, hair pulled back, eyes clear. I looked like myself, not the version my family preferred. Within minutes, my inbox started to fill. Messages from old classmates, researchers, engineers I had met at conferences who had been polite but distant. Some wrote congratulations. Some wrote that they had always believed in the idea. A few admitted they had not, and that the numbers had changed their minds. I replied in short, honest sentences, grateful and wary all at once. By mid-morning, the first email from Connecticut arrived. It was not from my family. It was a forward from an old neighbor, Mrs. Fletcher, accompanied by a single line. I thought you might want to see what your parents are telling people. Below her note was the text of an email sent from my father's address to a long list of recipients. He had written that I had stepped back from my work to take some time to get grounded, that I was considering different paths after a period of personal strain. There was no mention of TerraSense, of the acquisition, of the role in Chicago. Reading it, I felt something between anger and a tired kind of amusement. Even when the world had proof in front of it, they still clung to their version. Not long after, my phone buzzed with a new email, this one from an address I did not recognize at first glance. The subject line had my name and the phrase, equity allocation. I opened it and scanned the signature. Jacob Hart, attorney for the Ward family. The email was polished and sharp. Jacob wrote that he represented my parents and my sister, that they had informed him of their substantial financial contribution to my early ventures, specifically a $5,000 sum that had been essential in allowing me to relocate and restructure my professional life. He stated that in light of the recent news about TerraSense, my family expected a fair recognition of their early support in the form of a 30% ownership stake or equivalent financial settlement. If we could not resolve the matter amicably, he wrote, they would consider pursuing their rights through the appropriate legal channels. I read it twice. My jaw clenched so tight my teeth hurt. The check was still in my notebook in my bag. I could picture the memo line clearly. Fresh Start Fund. No mention of TerraSense. No mention of investment. Only their need to believe they had made me. For a fleeting second, the old reflex flared, the one that made me want to defend myself directly, to send back a long explanation. Instead, I took a breath, saved the email, and walked down the hallway to the small office AgriCorp had given me to use while I was in town. I set my bag on the desk, opened my laptop, and forwarded Jacob's message to Liam with the short note. This just came in. Can we talk? I did not have to wait long. My phone rang with an internal extension. I answered. Alina, Liam said, I am looking at the email. Are you free to come by my office? Yes, I am on the 20th floor. I will meet you in Conference 3, 2 minutes. When I walked in, he was already there with a printout of the email and my file open in front of him. He pulled out a chair for me. I'm going to be very straightforward, he said. This is not unusual when a founder has complicated family dynamics. It is ugly, but not unusual. I sat down, my hands folded together to keep them from shaking. They gave me that check 2 days ago, I said, at a country club. They also booked a flight to Austin and told me to leave Boston. They never mentioned TerraSense. They have never believed in TerraSense. Liam nodded. Do you have the check with you? I opened my notebook and laid it on the table. The check looked as neat as it had the day my father pushed it across the linen tablecloth. Liam examined it, then set it next to Jacob's email. He is claiming this was early funding, he said. But the memo line and the lack of any written agreement say otherwise. Under United States law, absent clear evidence of intent to invest or acquire equity, this is a gift. The fact that they framed it as a fresh start after pressuring you to relocate strengthens that conclusion. So they have nothing, I said. They have words, but no contract. If they push this publicly, they risk exposing themselves to counterclaims. They have already sent a mass email misrepresenting your situation. That edges toward defamation if it harms your professional reputation. My shoulders eased a fraction. What do we do? I asked. I will respond formally, he said. You do not answer Jacob directly. You do not answer your parents about this topic. Let me and AgriCorp handle it. That is part of what you agreed to when you signed. He typed as we spoke, coalescing his thoughts into sentences. Before he sent it, he turned the screen so I could read. Dear Mr. Hart, we acknowledge receipt of your message regarding your client's alleged financial interest in TerraSense. Our review of the relevant facts and documentation, including the enclosed check and associated circumstances, indicates that the $5,000 in question is a personal gift made after the development and deployment of TerraSense, not an equity investment or seed funding. There is no investment agreement, no evidence of intention to acquire ownership, and no basis under applicable law for your client's claim to any portion of TerraSense intellectual property or proceeds. Any further attempt to assert ownership on this ground would be without merit. Furthermore, we are aware of communications from your clients that mischaracterize Ms. Ward's professional activities and status. Should such statements continue in a way that harms her reputation or our business interests, we will not hesitate to pursue all remedies available. Sincerely. He hit send, with a calm finger. The sound of the outgoing mail chime felt like a small door closing. Later stories from Connecticut filtered back to me in fragments. A colleague on one of my father's boards mentioned that a few members had confronted him in a closed meeting. They had asked him why he had failed to recognize the potential of his own daughter when outside firms clearly had. He had reportedly shrugged and said that tech wasn't his area. That answer didn't play well in a room full of people who prided themselves on spotting value. From one of Marilyn's charity acquaintances, I heard that whispers had started at her luncheons. People had seen the Forbes article. They had seen the way she talked about having a struggling daughter, the way she had asked for prayers and sympathy. The contrast made them uncomfortable. Some decided not to sit at her table at the next event. In their world, distance was its own kind of punishment. Vivian, according to a mutual friend from law school, had tried to impress colleagues by mentioning family drama involving intellectual property. When the details came out and someone connected the dots to the Fresh Start Fund and the failed equity claim, a senior partner had laughed and asked if she had skipped the contracts class on the day they covered consideration and written agreements. The story circulated through her firm in a muted, ruthless way. In the middle of all that, my inbox pinged with the name that I had not seen since the Iowa trial, Caleb Swanson. For a moment, my throat tightened before I opened it. His message was short and unpolished, the way people write when they're not trying to impress anyone. Alina, I saw the article about TerraSense and what you did with AgriCorp. I also saw some coverage of how rough that first big test was. I was hard on you back then. I was scared, and I thought the easiest person to blame was the one with the laptop. That was not fair. The drought this year would have ruined us without the updated system. It works. You were right to stick with it. I'm sorry for the way I talked to you. I read it twice, then sat there with my hands on the keys, feeling something release that I hadn't realized was still tight. I wrote back and told him that I appreciated the apology, that we both had been under pressure, that I was glad the system was helping his farm now. There was nothing dramatic in it, just two people acknowledging the same complicated past from different angles. That night, back at the hotel, I placed the check on the desk and looked at it in the new light of everything Liam had said. It was still money my parents had intended as a ticket out of their way, not as support, but now it was also potential evidence, frozen in paper and ink. I logged into my bank app, endorsed the back of the check with a steady hand, and deposited it using the camera. The confirmation screen blinked that the funds were pending and would clear soon. After that, I opened my email and wrote a short message to my father's address and copied my mother and Vivian. I received the $5,000 you offered and have deposited it. Thank you for the support you intended to provide. I will not be needing further assistance. I kept it simple on purpose. No accusations, no explanations, just the formal acknowledgement that closed the loop. When I hit send, I did not feel triumph so much as finality. The next step was quieter. I scrolled through my contacts until I reached their names. Dad, Mom, Vivian. I hovered over each for a moment, remembering the years when my entire world had orbited around those 3 entries. Then, I deleted them one by one. My phone made no sound, no protest. The list simply reshuffled itself, cleaner and lighter. I placed the phone face down on the nightstand and lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in my life, the silence between us was not something they had imposed. It was something I had chosen. A few weeks later, I unlocked the door to my new apartment in Chicago with a key that still felt unfamiliar in my hand. The building was nothing dramatic. A mid-rise a few blocks from the river, brick and glass, and a lobby that always smelled faintly of cleaning supplies and coffee. Inside, the place was bright and spare. Big windows looking out toward the water, sunlight catching on bare walls that were waiting for a life to be hung on them. I walked from room to room, the echo of my footsteps a reminder that for the first time, I was starting somewhere without any history attached. No family photos arranged for guests, no inherited furniture chosen for status, just an empty living room, a small kitchen, a bedroom with a mattress on the floor, and cardboard boxes that held the parts of my life I had decided were worth carrying forward. The first piece of mail that arrived with my name and this new address was not a bill. It was an appointment card from the office of a therapist that one of the AgriCorp's human resources people had recommended, Charlotte Green, Tuesday afternoon. On the day of the session, I walked into a small office with soft light and two armchairs facing each other. There were framed degrees on the wall, but they blended into the background behind the bookshelves and plants. Charlotte was in her 40s, with steady eyes and a way of listening that made the room feel wider. She asked me what brought me there. I told her it was easier to talk about what had pushed me out than what had pulled me in. My parents gave me money and a plane ticket to get out of their way, I said. Then, they tried to take credit for everything you saw in Forbes. They have been rewriting my story since I was old enough to win school awards. She nodded. What did you learn about love in that house? She asked. That it was a performance, I said quietly. That it depended on how well you played your part in front of the right people. We spent the rest of the hour naming things I had never dared to label directly. Generational pressure, emotional neglect wrapped in beautiful language, the way my worth had always been measured in terms of how I reflected on them, never how I felt in my own skin. At one point, Charlotte said something that landed so plainly, it almost hurt. If they could not love you without controlling the story, that does not mean you were hard to love, she said. It means they did not know how to love without control. I sat with that long after the session ended. Life in Chicago began to collect its own small rituals. Mornings started with coffee by the window, watching the river change colors with the weather. Days were filled with meetings and field reports, with calls to farmers who wanted to install the new system before the next planting season. In the AgriCorp's offices, people said my name without attaching it to my family. I was just Alina, the person responsible for making sure the technology did what we said it would. One afternoon, a few weeks after I moved in, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, Dana stood there grinning, with a tote bag hanging from her shoulder. You moved without letting me carry a single box. Do you know how offensive that is to a friend? I laughed and pulled her inside. You would have color-coded the packing, and I did not have that kind of time, I said. She reached into the bag and pulled out a white mug. The words, "Data never lies," were printed across the front in bold black letters. For your new life, so you remember that the numbers loved you even when your family did not. I rolled my eyes, but my throat tightened anyway. Thank you, I said. I will drink overpriced coffee out of it and think of you every time a model does not crash. At work, Ethan treated me like a peer, not a miracle and not a pet project. In meetings, he would turn to me and say, Alina, what do you think? And then stay quiet while I answered. When people challenged my ideas, he let me handle it, stepping in only when the room needed structure, not when my authority needed rescuing. That kind of respect, simple and consistent, felt more radical than any headline. One evening, as I was checking my mail in the lobby, a woman with curly hair and a tired smile introduced herself as Maggie from down the hall. Beside her was a man carrying a casserole dish who turned out to be her husband, Louis. We keep seeing you come and go with a laptop and grocery bags. We figured it's time to stop just nodding in the hallway. We're having a few people over for dinner, nothing fancy. You should come." I started to reach for an excuse, an old habit, then stopped. "I would like that. Thank you." That night, I sat at their small dining table eating pasta and listening to stories about their kids, their jobs, their worries about parking tickets. No one asked me about my last name. No one cared what my parents did. When I mentioned work, they were interested in whether the tech actually helped farmers, not whether it looked impressive on paper. Back in my own apartment later, I sat on the floor with my back against the couch and scrolled through my phone. There were missed calls stacked like tally marks: 3 from my father, 9 from my mother, an entire column from Vivian, more than 40 in total. A few emails too, short lines asking to talk, longer ones hinting at misunderstandings, at the possibility of sorting things out if I would just make time. I opened one from my mother and read the first sentences. "We never meant to hurt you. Things got out of hand. People are talking and we need to present a united front." I closed it without finishing. There was a time when that phrase would have hooked deep into my chest. United front. As if I had ever been allowed to stand beside them as an equal. Now, sitting in a quiet apartment in a city they never pictured me in, I felt more unity with the hum of the fridge than with those words. I didn't reply. I didn't block their numbers either. I let the calls ring out into nothing. It wasn't about punishing them. It was about letting the distance exist without rushing to fill it with explanations they wouldn't really hear. One afternoon, an email arrived from a name I hadn't thought about since that meeting in Back Bay, Harper Lane. Her message was smooth and cheerful. She had seen the news, she said. She was impressed with how TerraSense had grown. She wondered if I might be open to discussing a possible collaboration on a new fund focusing on sustainable agriculture. There was a line about timing being everything, and another about looking forward. I read it once, then again, sensing the faint outline of the woman who told me I lacked leadership presence. The sting of that day was gone, but the memory of riding down in the mirrored elevator came back with surprising clarity. I typed my response carefully. "Harper, thank you for reaching out and for your kind words about TerraSense. At this time, I am fully committed to my role with AgriCorps and to our existing partnerships. I am not in a position to take on additional collaborations, but I appreciate you thinking of me. Best, Alina." I sent it without adding anything more. No pointed comments, no reference to the past, just a polite, closed door. Sometimes during therapy sessions with Charlotte, we would circle back to the idea of revenge. Not the loud kind, with shouting and courtroom scenes, but the quiet version I had stumbled into. "It sounds like you're not interested in making them pay," she said once. "I think they already are. They built their lives around being seen a certain way. Now people see the gap between what they said and what they did. I don't have to lift a finger." "And for you," she asked, "what feels like justice?" Being able to live without needing their approval. That's all I ever wanted, and it's exactly what they never learned how to give. On a warm evening in late summer, I stood on my balcony with the city spread out in front of me. The river was catching the last light, turning it into a strip of gold between the concrete. Somewhere below, traffic murmured and a siren wailed in the distance, part of the music of a place that did not know my history and did not care. My phone sat on the small table by the sliding door, screen dark. No names from Connecticut glowing at me, just the faint reflection of the sky. Behind me, the apartment held the sound of my own life. Half-unpacked boxes, a mug that said, "Data never lies," drying by the sink. A laptop waiting on the coffee table with a draft of a new proposal open and ready. I thought about the girl who had once left an awards ceremony early so her mother could be on time to a fundraiser. The teenager who had watched her sister be introduced as the future of the family while she stood holding coats. The young woman who had called home the night of her first big grant only to hear polite disinterest. For a long time, I believed that if I just achieved enough, if I impressed the right people, the people at home would eventually make room for who I really was.
Instead, they showed me who they really were. And walking away from that, finally and fully, had cleared enough space for a different kind of life to take root. I looked out over Chicago, over a city that had seen what I could build and chosen to say, yes. My success was not a product of running from my family, even if leaving them behind had been part of it. It came from every choice I had made to keep showing up for myself when they wouldn't. It came from nights in labs and fields, from people like Dana and Ethan and Caleb and even Charlotte, who had met me without the filter of the ward name. If you have ever been made small by the people who were supposed to protect you, if you have ever been told that your worth depends on how well you fit into a story that was written without your consent, I hope you hear something in mine. Would you choose to stay and shrink, or would you choose to rise and risk walking out of the frame they built for you? I chose to rise, quietly, stubbornly, in rooms they never entered. And in the end, that simple act of choosing myself was the most satisfying revenge I could have imagined. If any part of this feels familiar, if you have your own version of a country club table or a fresh start fund with strings attached, tell someone, share it, sit with it. You are not the only one.